It is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. In the early 2nd century AD, a Roman legion vanished from the historical record.
They're not there, so at some point in the 2nd century, something happens to them, they disappear, they're disbanded, something.
Here you've got 5,500 soldiers of Rome's elite fighting army. What happens to them?
We do not know what happened to it. It literally disappears from history.
It remains one of the mysteries. We need to find out.
Now, with the help of leading experts, I'm going to dive deeper into the story.
I'm going to be travelling across Britain, visiting some of the key sites associated with the 9th Legion on this island. From the central role it played in helping extend Rome's control, to a brutal run-in with Britain's most famous warrior queen. The question of what happened to the 9th Legion has fascinated people for centuries. This is the story of the 9th Legion.
In the last episode, we tracked the 9th's history right up to its last mention in the literature. A deadly night attack suffered somewhere in central Scotland in 82 AD, at the height of Agricola's campaigns in the north.
It's the last time the 9th Legion is ever mentioned in history. Ever. That's it. It's never again mentioned in history.
So what happened next? Well, to continue the story, we must now turn our attention to the archaeology.
Following the end of Agricola's campaign in Scotland, the 9th ultimately returned to its legionary fortress at York. And it's here that we have the next key in the story, the next key archaeological find, an inscription dating to the early 2nd century AD, which is located here at the Yorkshire Museum.
This monumental inscription is a dedication to the rebuilding of a major gateway in stone, and this gateway was probably part of the Roman fortress, most likely the major southeastern entrance to the fortress. The inscription is written in contracted Latin, and it's actually only the last line that tells us that this has anything to do with the 9th Legion at all. The first few lines of the inscription are actually dedicated to the Roman emperor at the time, Trajan, and it's essentially a list of his honours, titles and roles, which form a fairly extensive CV. We can see that we have Imp for Imperator or Emperor, and he's also listed as Pontifex Maximus or Chief Priest of the Empire.
The great thing about those sort of inscriptions is, I mean, they're not great literary texts, they just say who built this and the name of the emperor, and usually when you're citing an emperor you get a whole list of his titles, and because the titles change every year you can pinpoint the exact time that inscription dates to. So it's set up by the 9th Legion and it's dedicated to the Emperor Trajan, and the list of titles that he is given dates from December 107 AD to December 108. So we've got that 12-month period where that inscription is put in. But that's the last definitive physical evidence that we've got for the 9th Legion. After 108, that's the point where they disappear. So we know that in 108 they're in York, they're repairing the gateway. We know very little about what happens to them afterwards.
It's astonishing to think that that inscription is the last reference we have to the 9th Legion in Britain. After that, it's gone.
Within 15 years of this inscription, we find a new legion based at York, the 6th Victrix.
They were instrumental in rebuilding the Roman fortress here. The multangular tower, which you can see in the museum gardens here in York, which is the corner tower of the fortress. It has 10 sides, hence its name, the multangular tower, is the finest standing remains that show the activity of the 6th.
Now, at the start of the 2nd century AD, the 6th Victrix had been stationed on the Rhine, but in around AD 120, latest AD 122, the 6th was transferred to northern Britain, to the legionary fortress at York, Roman Eboracum. Now, why is this so significant in the story of the 9th? Well, the 9th had been stationed at York, but it seems now almost certain that by the time the 6th arrives at York, the 9th has gone. The York legionary fortress, it wasn't large enough to fit 2 full legions. So it suggests that by that time the 9th had gone. And this seems to be further affirmed that maybe the 9th isn't in Britain at all by Hadrian's great legacy on this island, the remains of which you can still see today. Hadrian's Wall.
Every unit which participated in building it left an inscription. Here, there, graffiti, official, every single unit. There's no inscription at all from 9 Hispana. So it did not take part in building the wall. For whatever reason, it wasn't around by then in Britain.
It is argued that the 9th was building part of the wall and hasn't left any inscriptions. The western sector of Hadrian's Wall was actually built in turf, so they could have created inscriptions in wood, and we have one from a different legion, which have completely disappeared. I don't like that theory. It doesn't fit with how I understand the building of Hadrian's Wall took place, which was in sectors of 5 miles apiece, and these sectors divide into 3 blocks of 5 miles, which suggests there's only 3 legions building in Britain, the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th, not the 9th.
So it appears that the legion was no longer in Britain by 122 AD, and we know that less than 50 years later, the 9th legion is no longer in existence anywhere.
In AD 168, we have a column being built in Rome, which is called the Colonnella Maffei. And this lists all the legions which are extant in the Roman Empire at the time. Probably at any one time in the Roman Empire, Principate period anyway, there are probably 30 odd legions. That's the case here. And we can date it because it's got the Italica legions listed, which are created around the time of the Marcomannic Wars. So we can date it fairly accurately. And on that column, which lists all the legions in existence in the Roman Empire at the time, in AD 168, the 9th legion isn't there. It's gone.
So what happened to the 9th Legion? Well, there have been a number of theories put forwards over the decades, indeed over the centuries, and to this day it remains the subject of heated scholarly debate.
So the starting point is to look at where we first became aware that it disappears from history. And this is with an antiquarian in the 1730s called John Horsley. John Horsley did an analysis of the entry and exit of every Roman legion to Britain, which still to this day, in actual fact, stands up to rigour, academic rigour. And he determined that the only one he couldn't work out where it went to, what happened to it, was the 9th Legion. And since that time, people looking elsewhere in the empire have drawn the same conclusion. Jump forward to the 1850s and you have a German academic, one of the leading Roman historians of his day, a leading antiquarian called Theodor Mommsen. And Theodor Mommsen wrote a multi-volume history of the Roman Empire. And in it, he took Horsley's observation about the disappearance of the 9th Legion and he started investigating it, and he came up with a hypothesis of himself, which he published in the later 1850s. And his hypothesis was that this legion had arrived, as we know, with the Roman invasion of Britain by Aulus Plautius on behalf of Claudius in AD 43, and it participated in all manifestations of the conquest campaigns. But later, something happens in the north, and it gets wiped out. And his theory was it was in York, and there was an insurrection of the local Brigantes in the far north of Britain, and they attacked York, which was the legionary base for the 9th Legion, and wiped it out. And this was the starting point of all the analysis about what really happened to the 9th Legion.
Mommsen centred his theory around the belief that northern Roman Britain was in a state of unrest in the early 2nd century, caused by imperial neglect.
Now, the interesting thing about the province of Britain at the beginning of the 2nd century AD is it's fairly quiet, because most of the military action is taking place well away from this northwestern corner of the Roman Empire. So, for example, the AD 108 reference to Trajan in the legionary fortress in York, while Trajan's spending most of his time fighting in Dacia, and then later fighting the Parthians in the Middle East. So there's very little action in his reign taking place compared to that in Britain.
I think, if anything, Britain has been progressively ignored. You know, it's an island away from the major centre of things. It's in barbarian territory. It's not top of the list of Rome's sort of concerns. And Trajan, emperor just before Hadrian, his concerns is winning military victory, military glory in the east, and also by having great big conquests. He doesn't think about Britain. Britain's done as far as the Romans are considered. It's been conquered. So his role is really taking soldiers out of Britain and putting them somewhere else. And you get the feeling that, I guess, those governors sent to the province, those soldiers serving there, feel increasingly abandoned, and they're not getting the attention that they deserve.
When Trajan died in August 117, his successor, Hadrian, inherited a Britannia rife with instability.
Now this is my old second-hand copy of the text, the ancient text, that is the Historia Augusta. And in it has a biography of the Emperor Hadrian. And interestingly, in this copy, in this text, it records how when Hadrian came to the throne, the Britons could not be kept under Roman control.
That's a nice, vague statement. We don't know whether that means that Britons in the province are rebelling or there's an invasion from outside Roman territory. But the suggestion is, for the fact that it's noticed by a sort of a court biographer, a biographer of Hadrian, suggests that it's a major incident. And later on, we're told that when Hadrian comes to power, there are two significant disasters, militarily speaking. We're told great numbers of soldiers killed by the Jews, great numbers by the Britons. The Jewish wars we know a lot about. We've got lots of literary texts for that. We've got to know nothing about what's going on in Britain. But it does suggest, if the situation is in Britain as bad as it is in Judea in the east, then we are talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of people being killed, troops being in disarray.
Our source for this unrest is Cornelius Fronto, a senator writing some 2 generations after the events. Fronto was a well-placed figure within the imperial regime, but he doesn't tell us the cause of this trouble. One possibility could lie in the political makeup of Roman Britain at that time.
So in the north and the west, the whole local economy is bent towards maintaining the Roman military presence there, needed to maintain this border, which by that time dropped back down to the line of, say, the Solway Firth to the Tyne. And therefore your experience of living in Roman Britain, if you're in the south and the east, is very different to the north and the west. But that means also that if you're one of the natives in the north and the west, you're not going to be as enamoured with the experience of being part of Roman Britain as if you were in the south and the east. And to that end, many people believe that the native tribes in the north, and particularly the huge confederation called the Brigantes, who effectively run from Chester all the way through to the Scottish borders, that whole area of northern England today and the Scottish borders, they were very, very recalcitrant members, as it were, of the Roman Empire.
I think the Brigantes, they never become wholly Roman. There are pockets of Romanness. When you look at Alba, you've got mosaics and you've got some degree of prosperity. But to all intents and purposes, you'll still see native farmsteads and areas really much as they were before. It's a dispersed population with small sort of farming units. Some are directly under the control of Rome because they're near a Roman fort. But generally speaking, I think the Brigantes never become wholly Roman, not like the Atrebates or the Cativalorni to the south, who become very Romanised, and you've got villas and temples and towns. The Brigantes aren't like that at all. Although they lose their independence, they never really become a functioning part of the Roman Empire. So the fact that military is there is always a negative impact on them.
Now, we know that more Roman soldiers came to Britain during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. The Victrix, for example, may even have come to Britain with Hadrian himself when he visited this island in around 122 AD. And we also know that other soldiers ventured to Britain at this time. A tombstone discovered near Rome for a certain Titus Pontius Sabinus records how he led a detachment of 3,000 soldiers to Britain on a British expedition. Now, could this expedition be linked to unrest in the north of the province, a Brigantes revolt? We don't know, but it's possible.
I think of all the tribes, if we're told that the Britons could not be kept under control, as Roman historians said, I think the most likely to rebel at that stage would have been the Brigantes. Of course, the 9th Legion at York is right in the centre of that. So if there is a rebellion, they're going to be on the front line of that. They're the ones who are going to have to deal with that as best they can. And because Britain's been such a neglected part of the Roman Empire and there's no formal frontier created, they are in the problem. They've got potential attack from the north, from those tribes who are not part of the Roman Empire. They've got the potential, the Brigantes rebelling against them, and they've got problems with instability in the south spreading north. So of all the legions, of all the military units in the province, the 9th are the most exposed.
The building of Hadrian's Wall may also be a suggestion for unrest in the area, and not just to the north.
And I think the thing is really when Hadrian's Wall is built, when he creates that frontier, we tend to think of it as a wall to keep out all the perils of the north, the barbarians to the north, to keep them out of Roman Britain. It's just as much a wall to tell the Brigantes, you're not getting any more support from anyone else. You are stuck inside Roman Britain now. So it's much as facing north as it's facing south. It's a permanent border, and it tells them you're in Roman territory, you've got to just suck it up. You are going to be Roman, and there's nothing you can do about it.
So the evidence does seem to suggest that at least the north of Britain was in some state of revolt, of unrest, of some instability in the early 2nd century AD. But could this be linked to the 9th's disappearance?
Well, the blunt answer is yes. Mommsen's theory was that it had been overwhelmed in an attack by the Brigantes on York, which was the legionary fortress in its home. Rosemary Sutcliffe's conceit was that it was defeated in an offensive operation in the far north of Britain. Either of those two could be accurate. The reality is, though, we'll never know, because there is absolutely no historical or archaeological evidence anywhere to say either was the case. A third sub-hypothesis could be that it was actually lost in a region-wide conflagration in the north and the unconquered far north, akin to the Boudiccan revolt. So 1, a Brigantian revolt; 2, it was defeated in an offensive operation in the far north; 3, a conflagration of the entire north of the province and the unconquered far north. All 3 could have happened, but we have no evidence for it.
The theory that the 9th was lost somewhere in northern Britain in the 2nd century AD is certainly the strongest in popular imagination. But the case is far from closed. It's important to remember that the Roman province of Britannia was just a fragment of a much larger empire that stretched the length and breadth of the Mediterranean and beyond. And it is within this much wider context that we must continue our narrative.
The AD 108 inscription from York is the last attested mention of the 9th Legion in Britain, but it's not quite the last mention we hear of the 9th from anywhere in the Roman Empire. Tombstones dating to the mid-2nd century AD survive on various frontiers of the Roman Empire which mention the deceased serving in the 9th Legion, or at least being related to the 9th Legion in some way or form. And one of the most interesting of these tombstones comes from a far-flung frontier, not in Britain, but on an eastern edge of the Roman Empire.
Well, the evidence we've got from inscriptions includes one from the far end of the empire at Petra. Petra's got some fantastic tombs cut into the rock. I mean, we're all familiar with the treasury from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. But as you explore Petra further, there are wonderful tombs. And one of these is to a man called Florentinus, who was governor of that province. And we know something about his career, not least also because we know his 2 predecessors as governor, so we can date him pretty closely to the late 120s. And his previous post but one was tribune in the 9th Legion. And these posts usually last for 3 years. So if we take the career as being normal, that is changing posts every 3 years, would bring him into the early 120s. for service in the 9th Legion.
Further inscriptions have been discovered elsewhere. In Rome, a memorial was set up to the senator Lucius Aemilius Carus in the mid-2nd century AD, which highlights, among the man's many other achievements, how Carus had previously served as a military tribune in the 9th Legion. Meanwhile, at the Roman legionary fortress of Lambysis near Tazult in modern-day Algeria, a dedication by soldiers of the 3rd Legion to their commander, Lucius Novius Crispinus, was discovered. Similar to Carus, this inscription, believed to have been erected sometime around 150 AD, records how Crispinus had previously served in the 9th Legion. These inscriptions have allowed some scholars to put forward a different argument for the fate of the 9th Legion. An argument where the 9th was not destroyed in the early 2nd century.
Well, we come back to Emily Rittling's article in 1925, where he looked at these career inscriptions. His argument was that these career inscriptions suggested that the 9th Legion was still in existence into the 120s, and Eric Burley looked again at the evidence and suggested one of these career inscriptions indicates that the 9th Legion was still in existence, perhaps even up to 130. So what came out suddenly was a ping of, if you like, disbelief in how people had previous to that point seen the end of the 9th Legion. He said, no, it can't have happened, can't have been destroyed in the early years of Hadrian's reign, because in the later years of Hadrian's reign, the careers of these officers suggest that it was still in existence.
More evidence has been uncovered since. A diploma, dating to around 140 AD, mentions how a certain Quintus Camurius Numisius Junior had previously served in Legio 9 Hispana.
So this is pushing the survival of the 9th possibly even further on.
So, if the 9th was not lost in Britain, the question is, where did it meet its end? Now, one theory is that the 9th was transferred to the Rhine, to the legionary fortress at Nijmegen, because it's here that we find a rare mention of the 9th outside of Britain.
Now, we do know that certainly a vexillation, so a unit from the 9th Legion, was deployed to the legionary fortress at Nijmegen sometime before AD 108 and AD 120. Not the whole legion, just a vexillation. And we know this because we have the stamps on the tiles they manufactured as part of the rebuilding process of the legionary fortress. The really interesting thing there is that it's not the usual 9th Legion stamp, because usually that's a 1 and an X. This actually is a V1111, and the only vexillation we know of anywhere in Roman Britain from the 9th Legion which stamped its tiles like that was based near Carlisle. So you probably have a vexillation based in the northwest of Roman Britain being redeployed for some reason to Nijmegen, probably for a short period of time. But there's no evidence at all that it carried out any fighting. And if you look at the major conflagration on the Danube in particular in the later 2nd century AD, the Marcomannic Wars with Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus and later Commodus, there's no evidence at all it took place or it even existed.
Now, given the lack of evidence for fighting along the Rhine at this period, it's unlikely that this was where the 9th disappeared. And it's a similar case for the River Danube. But there is one other area of the Roman Empire that we know for sure in the 2nd century AD that there was vicious fighting, that there was bloody conflict at this time.
To the east, Rome was involved in a series of bloody conflicts, particularly in Judea.
Now, it's not unusual when you have major incidents, either offensive or defensive in the Roman Empire, to have military units transferred all over the empire. It's probably more unusual than not to have a legion transferred from Britain in the extreme northwest of empire to the extreme eastern frontier in Syria. But it could have happened.
Generally speaking, only detachments of legions were moved, which is what we come down to with Nijmegen with just a detachment there. But there's still, for some years after this, another 30 or 40 years after 108, and the legion last recorded in Britain, whole legions were still being moved around the empire. So it's not impossible that the 9th was simply uprooted and transferred eastwards.
There is a series of events which could have been the context for the transference. You have the 3 exceptionally sanguinous Jewish revolts. The Great Revolt in the AD 60s and 70s. You have the Kitos War around the time of Trajan's conquests in the east in the AD 110s. And then you have the by far the most challenging Jewish revolt the Romans faced, which was the Bar Kokhba revolt in the AD 130s. And certainly in the latter, it seems as though at least one legion was lost. So the Romans lost a lot of troops, including a legion, in the Jewish revolts. And finally, you have the Roman-Parthian War from AD 161 to 165, when, at the very beginning in AD 161, when the Parthian king Brigantes IV invades from Armenia towards the Roman province of Cappadocia, the Roman governor in Cappadocia, so this is the northern part of the eastern border, Severianus, decides he's going to take matters into his own hand, decides he's going to be very brave, takes a legion with him that's unnamed. Remember that, the legion's unnamed, then and now. And he marches the legion into Armenia to try and stop Brigantes, and it's wiped out to a man, and he commits suicide. So we know there a legion's been lost in the Bar Kokhba revolt, and a legion's been lost in the Roman-Parthian War, both unnamed. So whether that's the 9th Legion or not, we don't know, but certainly the Romans lost a legion there.
So the 9th could have perished fighting in the east. We have the bloody conflict, and we know that legions were lost during this time period. But unfortunately, we still lack clear-cut evidence to support this. We have tantalising references that might support it, but the evidence is still not 100% there.
Well, one might say, well, where's the evidence for it being at all in the East? And I can't produce any. All I can say is what one of my university professors remarked, John Mann, was that the evidence for the existence and positioning of legions in the East is not good. I've been to see 4 of the legionary fortresses on the eastern frontier, and 2 are now underneath the Ataturk dams. 1 is underneath the town of Melitini, Melatia, and only 1 survives and has hardly been touched by excavations. So all these 4 sites have hardly been examined by archaeology, so we don't know what the evidence for their history is. It could be that there is evidence lurking there for the 9th Legion, and that, I think, is an exciting possibility that new evidence will be discovered somewhere along the eastern frontier for the 9th Legion.
But others remain unconvinced.
There is a sort of counter there. I think because Rosemary Sutcliffe's book, The Eagle of the Ninth, and the recent films and so on, has promoted in popular fiction the idea that the 9th was destroyed in Britain, has led historians and archaeologists to go against that and say that no, ridiculous. There's no evidence of a major, perhaps, uprising. We think the 9th was taken out of Britain and died somewhere else. We know that there are tile stamps in Nijmegen on the Rhine frontier, which probably dates to the mid-80s. We know that parts of the 9th were there, propping up the frontier before they were sent back to Britain again. There's no other fort in the whole of the Roman Empire that has evidence of the 9th. If they're in forts and building stuff, they will be stamping tiles. We've got none of that evidence whatsoever. It's possible they died on another frontier. We hear of significant losses in the east, but the fact that they're not actually mentioned, I mean, documentary sources for the time aren't great, but for me, I would say I would be 99.9% sure that they died fighting in Britain, because that's where they're based. It makes no sense to take them out before then and for them to die somewhere else. The probability is they're fighting and dying, trying to hold Britain together rather than going anywhere else. I mean, the fact that they are replaced by the 6th Legion, to me, suggests that they've borne the brunt of the fighting. They haven't disgraced themselves, because we still hear of ex-soldiers from the 9th who've retired and go on to live, as far as we can tell, a happy life 20, 30 years later. But I think they were very severely mauled to the point where they had so many losses they just can't be replaced. You can't just recruit more people to fill the gaps in there. It's easier to bring another legion over and to replace them and to absorb whoever survived into different legions and different units. So I think the evidence, as far as we can see, is more suggestive that the 9th died fighting, and they probably died somewhere in that area of York.
So the candidates are lost in the north of Britain, lost in the south of Britain, lost on the Rhine and Danube, lost in the east. I would put them in this order. Number 1, lost in the north. Number 2, lost in the east. Number 3, lost in the south of Britain. Number 4, lost on the Rhine and Danube. I believe it's most likely that the 9th Legion was lost in the north of Britain because there's no evidence it ever left the province, apart from that one single vexillation going to Nijmegen, nothing else.
I mean, the good thing about archaeology is that every new find changes the theory. If we find tiles with IX HISP in Judea or along the Danube frontier, brilliant. We can say we know that the 9th was moved out and they did die somewhere else. At the moment we haven't got that, so our best guess is that they died in Britain.
The possibility of them being lost somewhere in Britain remains, the possibility of them being lost somewhere on the Rhine, or just a disbandment. But it remains one of the mysteries. We need to find out.
What happened to the 9th Legion is a question that will continue to captivate imaginations and divide opinion. Was it lost in Britain, or did it get transferred and did it perish on another frontier of the Roman Empire? The debate continues. The truth is, we can't really make an absolute statement of what happened to the 9th Legion until archaeology uncovers some new groundbreaking evidence. But that makes me very excited for the future. We only need this new archaeological discovery and it could solve the mystery once and for all. The fate of the 9th Legion may be a mystery for now, but hopefully not forever.